It's Huluween on Disney Plus. Watch frightful family favorites like Hocus Pocus and Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas on Disney Plus.
I am the Pumpkin King!
Then take the terror to 10 with a thrilling new remake of The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, Scream, and more with Huluween on Disney Plus. All these and more streaming this Halloween season with Hulu on Disney Plus. Bundle subscription required. 18 plus. Select Hulu content via Disney Plus. Additional content on Hulu app. Terms apply. Visit disneyplus.com/Hulu for details.
Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other toppings, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
If you can hear me, take an encryption button off the trial.
Hello, True Spies listeners. Welcome back to our new assignment, True Spies Debrief. Alexis Papahelas is a leading investigative journalist and the executive editor of Greece's leading newspaper. He's also the author of A Dark Room, an extensively researched history of the role of the United States in Greece's 7-year military junta, beginning in 1967. True Spies producer Morgan Childs spoke with Alexis about this dark chapter in US foreign policy, about the 25 years he spent digging up previously untold secrets, and about the evolving role of journalism today.
Alexis, you are an intimidating person to interview for many reasons, not the least of which being that you've spoken with more people to make history than I can possibly count. Among them are Yasser Arafat, Barack Obama, George Soros, Bashar al-Assad. But someone that you spoke with on multiple occasions is Henry Kissinger, and that's where I'd like to start. You have written that you tried to ask Kissinger about Cyprus on multiple occasions, but found that he was particularly cagey on that topic. And in fact, much more than he was on Chile, for instance. What was it about Cyprus and Greece that made Kissinger so skittish?
First of all, thanks for hosting me, Morgan. It's a real pleasure. Let me say, Kissinger was a very complicated person, as you know. I think he had a real issue with Cyprus because one of the things that he really sort of despised was the fact that he was demonized by Greek Americans. An amazing scene that comes to mind is that when President Ford takes over after Nixon's resignation, one of the first meetings that Kissinger attends, which is a national security meeting at the White House, Kissinger is there. It's like late August, 74. And outside there are about 60,000 or 70,000 Greeks yelling against Kissinger for his role in Cyprus. And he could never get over that because he always thought that he was blamed for something that he was not responsible for. And I think basically Cyprus was an issue where he was both very cynical about it and also a bit out of his depth. He really mishandled the situation. And this is very clear for some of the declassified stuff that has come out since.
So let's step back a little bit because we don't talk about Greece very much on this podcast. Maybe take us back to the roots of the Cold War presence of the U.S. in Greece. What were the Americans trying to accomplish there as far back as the 1940s?
Okay, the Americans come in after the war. They take over from the Brits, who were sort of the dominant power in Greece before the war. There's a civil war that goes on between the Greek government and the Greek left. The Greek left is defeated. And then the U.S. basically creates a huge apparatus in Greece, which was very much geared towards defeating the left and making sure that the communists would never take over. So the CIA had a very strong presence here in Greece. A lot of it was Greek Americans, actually, people who spoke the language and so on, and who had been hired through OSS during the war. And the main purpose was to make sure that Greece would never fall into communist hands. So one of the things they were doing is they were very strong up in northern Greece trying to get people from Bulgaria, from Albania, from Yugoslavia to come over to flee to Greece, and they were debriefed by a lot of the CIA people. And also there were a lot of covert operations to make sure that the non-communist parties would win the elections and make sure that the left would never come to power. And they also created the Greek Intelligence Service. It was completely funded and organized by the CIA from its very beginning in the 1950s. And they even had a program called the Stay Behind program, where they had hideaways in all of Greece, which was full of secret weapons, money, uniforms, and so on. And the idea was that if Greece was overrun by Soviet troops, that some of the Greek raiding forces, special forces, along with some CIA people, would get some of that money, some of those weapons, and make sure there was a guerrilla effort against the Soviets up in the mountains. It's quite an amazing story.
And your earlier book, The Rape of Greek Democracy, takes its title from a now infamous cable sent by the U.S. ambassador to Greece. Could you talk about what that cable said and what it sort of revealed about the Americans' frame of mind when it came to Greece and Greece's democratic stability?
Yeah, this is a story that was told to me by the then U.S. ambassador, Philip Talbot. So the coup basically breaks out on April 21, 1967. And the ambassador sits down in his office to write a cable to Washington explaining what has happened. The then CIA chief was Jack Murray, who was a former Marine, I believe, major during the war. He puts on his old Marine uniform in order to go through all the blockades of the Greek military. He finally makes it to the embassy. He goes up to the ambassador's office, and the ambassador shows him a draft of a cable that he was sending to Washington. And he had put the headline, the rape of Greek democracy. So the CIA head takes the cable, looks at it and says, rape? What do you mean? How can you rape a whore? So that's the way, basically the agency was looking at the Greek democracy back then in the 60s.
I'm curious to hear your perspective as somebody who spent so much time working and also studying in the U.S., looking back on this period. But I suppose I'd like to get a little bit about your personal background in Greece first, because your latest book, A Dark Room, opens with a very personal story about how this national story intersects with your own family history. Could you talk about how your childhood and sort of coming of age in this period in Greece's history has informed and maybe also inspired your work as a documentarian?
Sure. I was a teenager back when the junta happened in Greece. It was a very tense time. I had a lot of friends and cousins and so on who got into trouble, even went to prison for some participating in anti-junta riots and so on. But the amazing story was that we're living in an apartment building. And at that time, there was sort of a rumor that Greece was ruled by an invincible dictator. His name was Ioannidis. But nobody had any clue what this guy looked like, because he was the head of the military police. So he was not, in the press. There were no photos of him or whatever. So I remember a relative of ours came from abroad, and he had this copy of Newsweek magazine. And they had a rare picture of this guy. I said, he's the invisible dictator of Greece. I remember my father looking at the picture, and he got really flabbergasted, because we realized that the guy was visiting the apartment upstairs from our house, basically because his sister was living right next to us. And then we realized, what all these bodyguards were doing, outside our apartment building and so on. And the incredible story is that the final chapter of this guy's tenure in power actually took place up in that apartment, because only one floor up from where I was living. And he, the day that the Turks overran Cyprus, he goes there with two of his lieutenants, and he has a conversation with somebody. We have no clue who it is. We suspect it was somebody he knew from the CIA, from his very close contacts with them. And he goes in and he talks to somebody for about half an hour. Then he comes out and says, it's all over. I'm going to give up power. That's it. So for me, it was like a seminal moment. And being a very curious child, I decided later on that I really want to know what's going on behind closed doors and, to become a journalist. But that was a moment that was kind of a defining moment for me when I realized what had really happened there.
I know that you spent, it was 25 years working on this book, and I'm curious to hear, did you feel that the characters in this story sort of solidified to you over the course of the 2.5 decades of working on this book, or did you feel that they fell into shape in a way that you sort of already understood who they were by the 1990s?
Well, actually both. I mean, some people came out very lively from conversations with them or with others, or from all the declassified transcripts of the different conversations. For example, Kissinger is amazing. I mean, in the spring of '74, there's a famous meeting in the State Department. And a lot of people, including the agency, are telling him that the U.S. should support the return of democracy to Greece because this junta wasn't really going anywhere. And they also warned him that there was going to be a lot of anti-Americanism in Greece and so on. And Kissinger turns around to them after listening to them for about half an hour and says, listen, this is the State Department, it's not the political science department. And this was so Kissinger. It was so realpolitik, so cynical, and so on. And then there were all these other characters, agency characters, like the famous Dr. Dirty, Gaston Vrakotos, who was a very famous CIA guy, Greek-American. He was in Greece for on and off for more than 20 years. There's some incredible stories about him. I never had a chance to talk to him because initially he refused and then he had dementia, so it was hard to, talk to him. But he's a central figure in this whole book. And he's definitely a bigger-than-life kind of guy. Very tough, very cold warriors, very cynical, brutal in many ways.
One of the major elements of this book is a 38-minute recording from a war council meeting of the junta held during the invasion of Turkey in 1974 in Cyprus. Tell me a little bit about what that recording reveals about the end of the junta and what we can take away from that audio.
This is an amazing, basically, piece of history. The head of the armed forces back then had this whole war council recorded, secretly recorded. And the main thing is you see the dictator, Ioannidis, feeling very betrayed by the U.S. and NATO, but mainly by the U.S. I mean, he kind of claims in that recording that he had some assurances that he could do the things he did in Cyprus and get away with it, and there will be no Turkish invasion. And he repeats this like 2 or 3 times, saying, I've been set up, and all that. And then the main thing is that he decides to go to war against Turkey and also to declare the unification of Cyprus with Greece. And the incredible thing is he gives the order during this meeting, but nothing happens. And the people who are there were basically sort of his own puppets, the prime minister, so-called prime minister, the generals, and so on. They actually resist his orders. So you can see the implosion of this very powerful man, who everybody was like really fearful of within these 45 minutes. And then the meeting sort of breaks up in chaos.
And tell me a little bit about the response to these revelations.
I think it was, for me, it was very, it made me very optimistic, the fact that a lot of the young people watched this series, this documentary. The ratings were phenomenal. And I think there's sort of a real desire here to learn more about history in a non-ideological way, in kind of a factual way. And I think a lot of people were basically impressed by the fact that, the whole story was there in front of their eyes. I mean, there were a lot of rumors, a lot of urban legends, conspiracy theories, and so on. But this was the first time where you had former CIA guys basically confessing to, all kinds of stuff that was going on. A lot of the junta people or assistants to some of the junta leaders telling, the story behind the scenes. And I think that basically it was let's say it was almost like a painful tutorial in our past.
Tell me a little bit about, so I know that you were really coming of age when the coup was launched and became quite political. And this was really the crux of your political coming of age. Why then did you go on to study in the United States and then to work there?
Well, the truth is that I was very anti-American in my younger age, as everybody else was in Greece. I participated in a lot of demonstrations against the U.S. embassy because of its policy on Cyprus and all this. And I still think that it was a huge mistake, the way they treated the Cyprus issue and the way they supported the Greek dictatorship. I think it was a huge mistake on moral and policy grounds as well. But then I decided to go to the U.S. because I basically thought that I could get a very good liberal college education in the U.S. It was a very different U.S. from what we're experiencing these days. And also, one of the things that really intrigued me when I first got to the U.S. and I started studying history was how open people are, about talking about their past. I would go to different think tanks or universities, and you would see all these like former officials or even presidents, talk about things in the past in a very open way. And that's something that really, really impressed me, really intrigued me. And that's how I actually decided to sort of get involved in history.
And has your life in the States had any sort of negative influence on your work in Greece? I read an interview with you suggesting that you'd been accused of having a special relationship with the U.S. and sort of favoring America to your home in Europe.
Yeah, I've gotten this part of criticism because, anytime you get involved into investigative work, and I've done a lot of investigative work on terrorist organizations and so on, you get a bit of that pushback. But I do know that that's not the case. And I know that, both my reporting and my history writing has been quite objective and doesn't have anything to do with whether I lived in the U.S. for 20 years or not.
So where's the English translation of A Dark Room?
Actually, I have the first book translated. I got it done about 6 months ago, The Death of the Rape of Greek Democracy. Mm-hmm. And the second book is being translated as we speak. So hopefully by next year, I'm going to have it published in English.
Oh, that's great to hear. It does seem like must be an English-speaking audience that would benefit from understanding sort of what unfolded as a result of this engagement or manipulation in this chapter of Greece's history.
Yeah, I think there's a big story to be told with a lot of, useful conclusions, let's say, for what's going on today. And also, there are so many people who are involved with Greece in the 60s and in the 70s who played a very important role. And I think for me, it's important that all this come out in a very kind of objective and realistic way, let's say.
Yeah, I know that because the book is so many years in the making, you started research for it in the 1990s, I believe. And I'm curious how President Clinton's position on the Greek junta sort of might have enabled you to do new work on the subject.
No, actually, I was very lucky because having lived in the U.S. for 20 years, I met a lot of the former U.S. officials, State Department mainly, who were very critical of U.S. policy towards Greece, and they offered me a lot of details, even some stuff from the paper trail and so on from the past, and they really made me understand what was going on, and they really wanted their story heard out because they were really pissed off, let's say, at what especially the Nixon administration had done in Greece. But then the amazing thing is that, even though I tried to have a lot of stuff declassified through the Freedom of Information Act and so on, we had some real difficulty. And even during the Clinton administration, I think there was a lot of pushback by some of the old Greek hands that, some of this stuff shouldn't come out and so on. Eventually, I managed to get, a few things, mainly through the Clinton era. But I also got a lot of stuff through informal sources, so to speak.
And what else did the reporting or research process involve for this? I'm curious how this ended up being a project that stretched over so many decades.
Yeah, it was a lot of time spent with like former agency people. Like I remember this very old, in his late 80s guy. He had flown into Greece during the war. He had parachuted into Greece right before the Germans left. He had actually liberated a couple of Greek towns along with the communist guerrillas that he fought against afterwards, which was an amazing story in itself. And this guy was in Greece for many years. He was the liaison with the special forces in Greece. So he had set up all this network of secret hideouts and caves and so on. And he was, one of those guys that, he had lived through everything basically. And I would go almost every weekend up to his house in somewhere in Maryland, and I would spend time with him. He'll tell me all these stories, how he was flown on into Greece secretly from Vietnam to tell the Greek dictator, the first one, Papadopoulos, not to kill one of the famous Greek politicians back then. And he basically read him the cable from the CIA because he wanted to make sure that he wouldn't do it. And then they went on sort of joking about it. And this guy was a real, junta lover also, because all these people were very close to him. They had all these close bonds from the Cold War period and so on. And I remember one day I said, I'll go to Greece. I might see Papadopoulos, the dictator who was by then in prison. He was actually in a hostel, but under guard. And he said, oh, great, I'll give you a picture that I have with him. So he hands me over this picture where, they were handing up in northern Greece in 1965. And it's half a CIA station along with Papadopoulos, who 2 years later would become the dictator. And that in itself was an amazing piece of history. So I would spend a lot of time talking to these people, sort of debriefing them, listening to the stories, and getting a feel for what was really going on.
There's one story that sticks out about you getting to know the king of Greece. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is actually a very funny story because the former king of Greece, he was a very naive, very polite, but very naive kind of guy. So the way I got to know him is when I first published my first book, The Rape of Greek Democracy. There was a story in there about a guy who was an assistant defense attaché in Greece, and he was playing squash with the king. And in the classified stuff, it became very clear to me that this guy was what they call controlled American source. So he was either a CIA or DIA agent, I don't know, and he was obviously debriefing the king on what was going on. So I had that in the book, and the former king calls me up from London. I was in DC, I think, back then. And says, I can't believe you're writing this about this person. He was a friend of mine. And, there's no way he was an intelligence operative because he was a very nice guy. And I said, well, probably they chose him because he was a very nice guy. And then he was like, no. He was always asking me about what was going on in the palace or with the government. But I got to know more about what was going on in the embassy than he thought, he was getting from me. Which I thought was very naive of him, because the guy, even 30 years later, even though it was very clear that this guy was placed there, to get info from him, he refused to deal with it.
If you don't mind, I'd like to take a little bit of a left turn and ask you about the term deep state. I'm sort of surprised to see it come up so many times in preparing to speak with you and familiarizing myself with your work. I know the term deep state has a lot of baggage in the United States today, but I understand that it is actually Turkish in origin. And I think you use it in a specific and maybe perhaps more of the original context. Could you tell me a little bit about what you mean when you use that term?
Deep state in the Greek context, at least, doesn't exist anymore. But in the Cold War period, especially, there were people who were in positions of power in the intelligence, in the security services, and so on, and who were there regardless of who was in government, basically. And there were people that had acquired a lot of leverage, a lot of power and influence, over time. They were very closely knit and secretive kind of group. And they were very close, of course, to the U.S. I mean, all of the Greek deep state for many years was basically very, very closely allied, even financed by the U.S. security services. So that was the definition of the deep state back then, I would say. and very Cold War focused, very, very much, anti-communist, anti-leftist, and so on.
And when you use the term now, what is the flavor of it, and how perhaps do you use it in a different way than one might hear it in U.S. media?
Well, I mean, the way I gather it now in the U.S. is that deep state is more of a leftist deep state, which prevents somebody like President Trump do whatever he wants to do. I think it was the other way around, basically. I mean, it was a very right-wing deep state in Greece that was making sure that the left would not come to power. So it was not liberal or anything like this. I mean, the way I get it in the States is that, what people think or perceive as deep state is kind of very, very liberal, very kind of, left-leaning perhaps, something like this. It was completely the opposite in the Greek context.
You are widely quoted as saying that you believe the job of a journalist is to go against the current. I believe that comes from an interview that you did back in 2009. Of course, you're not just a journalist, you're also the executive editor of the leading Greek newspaper, and you've also led that newspaper through a debt crisis and also the unraveling of the media landscape. And so I'm curious now, from where you stand at this point, do you still feel the same way about the need of journalists to go against the current?
I do. I felt like if you've seen the movie The Perfect Storm, I felt like the captain, in a boat in the perfect storm, in the sense that, I was the head of a paper when Greece was going through a huge political and economic crisis. We went through a structural crisis because we're losing a lot of our circulation and our advertising revenue and all this. We had all the crisis of legitimacy for legacy media and so on. And I learned two things from this period. One was that it's very important to listen to people. It's very easy, to sort of be part of an establishment and not listen to the average person, what they go through. And I think I made that mistake during the financial crisis. So that was an important lesson. But the second lesson, which has something to do with going against the current, was that it's important to listen to people, but not to become populist as well, not to go with the flow just because things, lead you a certain way, because there's a lot of social pressure and so on. So there were a lot of moments when, for example, when we're going through our financial crisis, we had a lot of pressure to, become very populist and say, whatever, most people were saying, but we're saying, no, it's important to go through a fiscal adjustment. It's important to do some reforms. And that was very, very unpopular. We had demonstrations outside our building. We had a lot of, letters and so on, people criticizing us. But I thought that, we thought that was the right thing to do. And that's what we did. And I think it paid off because people realized that you're not lying, at least, that you're not playing around with facts, based just on ratings or circulation and so on.
This has been terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Morgan. A pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning in for this episode of The Debrief. We hope you enjoyed this conversation between True Spies producer Morgan Childs and Alexis Papahelas. More debriefs are available exclusively to SPYSCAPE Plus subscribers. You'll also be able to access other premium series like The Razumov Files, our ambitious retelling of Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes. And for true crime fans, there's The Great James Bond Car Robbery, the story of the hunt for James Bond's most notorious set of wheels. Subscribers also get new episodes of True Spies early and ad-free. Subscribe to SPYSCAPE Plus at plus.spyscape.com. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?
D-Day doesn't happen all at once. For around a week afterwards, landing craft and the churn of boots batter the dark green sea to foam. Needless to say, the air is thick with bullets, making land in one of the US Navy's lightweight PT torpedo boats. He's 22 years old, with dark hair and expressive eyes. Right now, they're expressing that he's scared out of his mind. He's part of a secret unit of US Army interrogators charged with extracting tactical and strategic information from prisoners of war. History remembers them as the Ritchie Boys.
True Spies, the classics. From SPYSCAPE Studios. Search for True Spies wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey folks, get ready for a new season of Blowback coming Monday, September 22nd. This time around, we're covering the Cold War showdown in Africa.
When apartheid South Africa invades the newly independent nation of Angola, revolutionary Cuba sends its own army to defend its African ally, while the United States backs a warlord whose only goal is power.
Subscribe now at blowback.show and get the entire season when it drops, ad-free. Blowback.show.
Life's full of big money decisions. Dividend versus growth stocks, tapping home equity, even navigating tariffs.
And for every smart tip out there, there's another one that sounds smart but isn't.
That's where NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast comes in. I'm Sean Piles, a certified financial planner professional.
And I'm Elizabeth Ayola. On NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast, our finance journalists do the homework so you can make confident wealth-building moves.
Whether you're building your portfolio or protecting it, we've got the facts and a little fun along the way.
Follow NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast on your favorite podcast app.